Welcome back. I'm Annisa Omar. The opposition in Democratic Republic of Congo called a strike to warn President Joseph Kabila. The strike, branded Call to the People, was issued by a coalition including dozens of political parties and civil society organisations. Khalil Charles tells us what happened.
Many shops were closed and buses from the Transco public transport service were almost empty. A stoppage by many taxi and motorcycle taxis also prevented people from getting to work. The strike, branded Call to the People, was issued by a coalition including dozens of political parties and civil society organisations. They are allied to the two main opposition parties in Parliament, consisting of parties that quit the presidential majority last November. Opposition leaders believe Kabila wants to get the constitution to run for office again after his final mandate expires in December. Kabila's foes argue his call for dialogue is a plot ahead of the elections due at the end of the year. In January 2015, several dozen people were killed in Kinshasa when security forces cracked down on rioters after an opposition demonstration spiraled out of control of the organizers. Ahead of Tuesday's protests, police have announced a massive deployment to ensure that strikers did not try to prevent people who wanted to work from getting to their jobs. But few police officers were seen on the streets except around the Parliament building.
Joining us for this is Dr. Phil Clark, who is an expert on the Democratic Republic of Congo affairs. Thank you for coming, Phil. So a strike. Why did this happen and what were the aims?
I think the strike shows just how widespread the opposition is to this idea that Kabila could run for a third term. And this was one of the few things that really brought all of the opposition political parties, trade unions, student groups, universities together. It's a real fear that Kabila is planning to run for a third term and really to entrench himself as president for a long time into the future. And we haven't seen this level of opposition to Kabila since he became president nearly 15 years ago. He's always had pockets of opposition, but this is the first time that so many different groups have come together. And I think it's a sense, too, that whereas before he used to have a high degree of opposition around Kinshasa, the capital, and in the west of the country, what's different this time is that the opposition is right across Congo. And so there were strikes and protests even in the east of the country where Kabila has typically been quite strong. So this suggests that there's a growing national movement against him. And I think we're likely to see these kinds of strikes and protests even more in the next few months.
And how was it possible for this galvanization of opposition to come together? You're mentioning trade unions and businesses and other civil society organisations. Is there a forum, as it were, or do you just think they're all under the same plight?
The civil society in Congo is extremely energetic and actually very well organised, and that's something that goes back, I mean, even to the period of Mobutu's dictatorship from the 1960s onwards. Congo's always had very strong trade unions. It's always had a very strong media. Its civil society has always been very robust. The government has tried to crack down against civil society quite a lot in the last 10 or 15 years. But what we're seeing at the moment is the ability of that civil society to come together. Social media plays a big part in this. So Twitter and Facebook in particular have been very important tools for galvanizing this kind of broad-based support. And the fact that a whole range of political parties have been able to get their members together, to get them to agree to this strike, shows just how widespread the anger is against Kabila. It's not just one or two political parties or small segments of the society. It's right across Congo, and so that's why you were able to see
this support is limited. Would you say? Because as we know, the opposition leader was arrested in regards to this strike prior to its coming. Do you think there is freedom, as you say, in the press and within civil society organisations having the ability to say what they want, but there is a limit in terms of there being a one-party rule?
There's an increasingly draconian tendency within Kabila's government. There's no doubt about that. And so, for example, about 6 or 7 months ago, a major protest in Kinshasa was put down violently. As you mentioned, various opposition political leaders have been put in jail. There has been some harassment of dissident journalists. So even in the spite of that kind of government behaviour, civil society is still doing its utmost to come together. One other thing that's very important here is that Congolese civil society is also learning a lot from the other protest movements in Africa over the last 3 or 4 years. Civil society leaders in Congo held a very large conference about a year ago where they brought in Senegalese and Burkinabe protest leaders. And in fact, the Congolese government tried to break up that meeting. They were very worried about civil society learning tactics from other African countries.
Okay, so if we bring it back to the strike itself, why was it that they were striking? I understand that it was a third term that the president wanted, and it was not constitutionally correct. Is there a way of making this law in terms of the democratic principles there, or is it simply we have to protest?
I think the feeling within the opposition ranks is that Kabila is hell-bent on an illegal process of trying to change the constitution to run for a third term. The only legal way that he could do that would be to hold a national referendum. And if the majority of Congolese citizens voted for a constitutional change, then it would be legal for him to run for a third term. But it's extremely unlikely that Kabila would even bother to organise that kind of referendum. And even if he held a referendum, I don't think the majority of Congolese would agree with that. So the opposition are fearful of an illegal manoeuvre by the president, and that's the reason that we saw this massive strike this week.
So a strike, as it were, it also sent a strong message to the president. Do you think he'll listen, or do you think it is the context of the country to not necessarily have free and fair elections?
The history of Congo as a whole, but most importantly, the history of Kabila as president, suggests that he's very unlikely to listen to this kind of popular protest. The first presidential elections in nearly 50 years were held in Congo in 2006. Kabila made it almost impossible for political opponents to campaign and to challenge him at that vote. In 2011, he used a huge amount of crackdown against the opposition and their supporters. He's never come across as a Democrat, and in fact, quite the opposite. He's led Congo in a very despotic way. And that's part of the reason why there's so much anger about his government. He has not been a Democrat. Development and security has not spread across the country. People are really fed up with his rule. And so the idea that he could run again and potentially stay in power for another 5 or even more years is the kind of thing that many Congolese people are very worried about.
And is democracy the way of gaining the economic and social stability? What are the factors driving Congolese to strike, not just a political new leader?
The main accusations that everyday Congolese make against Kabila is that his government is extremely corrupt, and that the president and some of his inner sanctum have lined their pockets and made a huge amount of money, while the bulk of Congolese continue to live in abject poverty. And that's particularly the case in the east of the country, where levels of poverty are extreme, and also where people have experienced massive violence now for the best part of 15 or 16 years. especially in the east of Congo, which is a place that I do a lot of research in. The main complaint about Kabila is that he's kept himself very comfortable in Kinshasa in the west, and he's completely abandoned the idea of peace and security in the east of the country. And people are really fed up with that. I think people want to change. They want a president that can bring wealth and prosperity, but also peace and security.
So the protests were widespread across the country, would you say? And has that making a statement there, saying that actually there may be pockets of abject poverty in some areas and there may be wealth, but hey, we're all Congolese and we're going to try and make it better through our own means?
That's one of the things that's very unusual about the strikes this week, is that this was a really nationwide phenomenon. In the past, we've seen protests and mass strikes in Kinshasa, the capital. That's a place that Kabila has never had substantial support. But he's always been able to buy the support of pockets of the population in the east of the country, including Katanga province, where he's come from. This week, we saw this strike extend way beyond Kinshasa to places like Goma and Bukavu in the east. And I think what this shows is that there is a much wider base of opposition to Kabila than we've seen in the past. What that also means is that he hasn't been able to spread the wealth outside of the capital city. This means that poverty is still rife. It has been for a very, very long time. Conflict is still raging, especially in the east of the country. At the last two elections, people in the east, I think, hoped that Kabila might be able to bring peace and stability. But by 2016, people have largely given up on that hope. And so the opposition really is nationwide, and Kabila's legitimacy is sort of disappearing by the day.
And do you think the education via the media and other forms of information in terms of schooling and just the rise of young people within the country, and given that young people make up most of the African content, is really an element that the current president is not really the man for?
Congo is one of the youngest countries in Africa. I think that the average age of the national population is now about 17 or 18. So what we are seeing is a new protest movement led by young Congolese. If you look at most of the civil society leaders, including those who've been trying to build connections with other protest movements in Africa, many of these actors are very young. They're in their mid to late 20s. So they're very energetic, they're very ambitious, and they look at the current state of affairs and think, Congo under Kabila is not going to give us what we want. And this is a population that Kabila has not been able to appeal to. He hasn't been able to convince young Congolese that in the next 5, 10, 20 years that they're going to find their lives significantly better. So it's true that this is a very young and a very vibrant protest movement.
And this election is supposed to happen later this year. It's stagnated, and there's been claims from the opposition that that's a way of sort of allowing the president to have a third term by delaying it. Do you think there is that inability to have a democratic principles in the constitution to back up elections that are fair?
This is the real concern of the opposition movement, that Kabila is stalling. He's trying to buy time to enable him to put the process in place that would allow him to run for a third term. And the longer that he delays the elections, the more likely it looks that he will try to run for a third term. He's been doing things like manipulating the leadership of the National Electoral Commission. He's tried to say that Congo needs to generate an entirely new electoral register, and it should hold a new census before these next elections are held. Most of that is nonsense. Congo has a very robust electoral register because of the last 2 national elections that have been held in the last 10 years. There really is no good electoral or political reason why these elections can't go ahead in November of this year. And the opposition, I think, are quite rightly saying that. They're saying there's no good reason why these elections can be delayed. The only reason Kabila is doing this is because he wants to buy time to run for a third term. So that's why they're very angry about this.
So we'll see what happens with Kabila and his opposition and the opposition leaders. We hope to follow this story closely. Thank you for commenting, Phil Clark. Now, following an initiative from Gabon's government to regulate gold digging, men panning for gold must sell what they find to the West African state, a situation the miners are unhappy with, especially in the face of growing competition. Competition from the Chinese mining companies. Aaron Charles has this report for us.
In the remote wilderness of the Belenga Mountains in northeast Gabon, men, shovels in hand, dig from morning to night, filling wheelbarrows with soil laced with what they're looking for: gold. The clearing in the equatorial forest is covered with dozens of holes, some 4 meters deep. William Mboma employs 5 or 6 workers for around 10,000 CFA francs, which is around £12 per day. On good days, his team finds around 9 or 10 grams of gold.
C'est pas aussi facile que ça, très difficile. Il y a trop d'obstacles, le plus souvent il y a des reptiles, tout ça là, mais on est obligé de faire avec.
The production may be small, but now Gabon's government requires that these men panning for gold must sell what they find to the state. It's a situation that the artisanal gold miners don't like, especially in the face of growing competition from Chinese mining companies. Youth unemployment stands at more than 30%. In both the city and the countryside, he says, there are no companies which train or hire young people. Jobs such as gold panning are often the first resort. But in 2014, the government decided to address what they called anarchy of the situation and launched a system for buying and collecting small-size production. Wesbert Masunda is director of the Gabonese branch for gold collection, a subsidiary of Société Équatoriale des Mines, and is now charged with developing Gabon's mineral resources.
L'état de l'activité dans le pays est une forme d'anarchie que nous voulons réorganiser, regrouper en forme de coopérative, en forme de mutuelle d'orpailleurs pour avoir une meilleure visibilité et un meilleur contrôle de l'activité.
Last year, the CGCO collected 55 kilograms, around 121 pounds, of gold, a modest amount considering that around 10,000 people work in gold panning nationwide, according to the Worldwide Fund for Nature in Gabon. Gabon is home to a wealth of mineral riches, including manganese, iron, uranium, and diamonds that have yet to be exploited, and are attracting more and more Chinese companies already involved in oil, wood, and public works. Gold mining began in Gabon in the 1940s during the French colonial era, and gold panning today takes place at the old sites. But a few months ago, excavators cleared out a new large section of the forest. The Gabon mining firm SEM, which hopes to discover new reserves of gold, has signed a partnership with Chinese company Mianging to explore the area.
Hard work for such a precious commodity. We wish them the best in this endeavour. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of the programme, but I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me and for you at home for watching. Whilst many in the Democratic Republic of Congo have protested last weekend, residents of the Goma celebrated the 3rd edition of the Amani Festival, featuring Senegalese musician Ismail Lo, who said it's time for the country to find peace. He sang his hit single Jamo Africa. We leave you with scenes of this and some very energetic Burundian drummers. See you soon.